Omelette, during the festival of summer, a city of joy and delight. Bells ring, processions move through streets where no misery exists. How can I describe such joy to you? Omelette has everything, beautiful and pleasurable, yet nothing excessive. No kings or slaves or secret police. Add then whatever you wish, drugs, religion or technology. Whatever your imagination requires to believe in their happiness. Yet one thing is certain in Omelette. Somewhere, beneath a public building, in a basement room, there is a child. It might be a boy or girl, perhaps 10 years old, but appears 6 due to malnourishment. The child is feeble-minded, sitting in his own excrement, occasionally whimpering. It was not always so. It remembers sunlight and its mother's voice. It cries out, "I will be good." But no one listens to him. Everyone in Omelette knows this child exists. Some come to see it. Most have seen it. They understand that Omelette's happiness, the beauty, the delight, even the abundance of harvest and the splendor of their lives depends solely and wholly on this child's misery. If this child were brought into sunlight, if it were cleaned and fed and comforted, at that moment all prosperity and beauty and delight in Omelette would wither. Those are the terms. The people of Omelette understand that there is no way to help the child without destroying everything. Even the child, they reason, after so much suffering, is now too degraded to know any real joy. Their happiness is not founded on ignorance, but on full knowledge. Most accept this terrible paradox. Children learning of it feel rage, disgust. Some weep, some anger, but all eventually understand that even if the child were released, it will not get much good on his freedom. The child's suffering makes possible the nobility of their knowledge. Singapore's rapid rise from third world to first was not a miracle, but a deliberate insertion into global capitalism. Chua Bing-Huat observes that Singapore's economic success was overwhelmingly the result of doing everything that is necessary to achieve capitalist growth. Now, in Singapore, the logic of capital operates unfettered, elevated to an ideological principle of national pragmatism, such that any policy contributing to growth is deemed inherently good, and every public policy is accessed by its economic contribution, while concerns about inequality, justice, or labour conditions are trivialized as secondary academic issues. Now in practice, this has meant structuring society to serve capital. Labour unions were tamed under a state-aligned Congress. The population was mobilized as a human resource, and meritocracy, or the idea of meritocracy, was enshrined to allocate rewards and justify outcomes. Now, such measures ensured a disciplined, low-cost labour force to attract foreign investment, while any social costs were downplayed in the name of national development. Crucially, this unfettered capitalist logic rationalizes labour exploitation as a necessary trade-off for prosperity. Now, under these conditions, for a very, very long time, exploitation of migrant workers were normalized, and Singapore's gleaming skyscrapers and spotless streets were maintained by migrant construction workers who worked punishing and terribly long hours, slept in terrible conditions for a fraction of the average Singaporean's wage. Their toil was hidden away in plain sight, seen as part of the natural order of a global city. Now, Alata's historical analysis reveals that such attitudes are not new at all, but rooted in colonial capitalism's approach to labour. In the 19th century Malaya, British colonial policy was driven by unlimited greed for profit and the subordination of all other interests to this, an ethos that considered human life and health of secondary importance. Now, the parallel to modern Singapore is provocative. While today's working conditions for migrant workers are far less grotesque, the underlying logic that wealth for some requires the sweat of others, and that those others may be accorded fewer rights and little empathy, remains intact. Just as colonial planters enriched themselves by squeezing labour from imported workers, Singapore's status as a first world metropolis is maintained by migrant workers from poorer nations who built the city's infrastructure, cleans its home, and staffs its service sector. Often under contracts and restrictions local citizens will find unacceptable. Now, the specifics have completely changed. Today's workers migrate voluntarily, often for better and admittedly better global wage options, rather than by force or debt bondage. But the structural dependence on an underclass of labour is continuous. In both cases, prosperity is structurally dependent on exploitation, a dynamic papered over by narratives that cast the exploitation as a rational, inevitable outcome, or almost disgustingly a deserved outcome. For the longest of time, migrant workers in Singapore were staying in rather terrible conditions, with many of them frequently crammed into very tight and uncomfortable spaces. It was only until the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, where migrant workers, due to their overcrowded conditions, accounted for almost 90% of the over 60,000 cases confirmed in Singapore, where the government realised that they had to do something about it. Not because of workers' well-being, but because it was spreading to the rest of Singaporeans. More recently, another hot-button issue has arose. Migrant workers are often transported to work sites on the open decks of lorries, a practice widely criticised as unsafe. Yet, economic pragmatism has been invoked to defend it. In recent years, multiple accidents, some fatal, have underscored the dangers of ferrying workers in the back of trucks. Now, public calls repeatedly to require safer transport. Home, which is a NGO dedicated to raising migrant workers' rights, have requested governments to use older buses, which are much safer to transport migrant workers instead. Now, while public calls to require safer transport have grown louder, the government's response epitomizes its pragmatic calculus. Now in Parliament, Senior Minister of State for Transport, Dr. Amy Khor, acknowledged that banning lorry transport for workers is a well-intentioned safety suggestion, but not a practical solution for Singapore. Now she argued that many small-medium enterprises could not afford the financial constraint and operational challenges of switching to buses or separate vehicles for workers and equipment. Citing a shortage of bus drivers and the need for efficiency, she warned that a ban would have significant impact on these businesses, potentially causing a trickle-down effect, causing project delays in HDB flats and constructing of MRT lines, resulting in higher cost for all Singaporeans. Now in short, the state openly prioritised economic expediency over the safety of migrant workers, arguing that the nation cannot afford to protect workers if it means burdening businesses. Now, critics note that this variance inevitably tilts towards preserving business interests and low costs. The result is a tacit acceptance of risk to workers' lives in the name of economic competitiveness. Such reasoning lays the core of Singapore's structural exploitation. Under the banner of pragmatism, the comfort and safety of migrant workers are treated as negotiable variables rather than non-negotiable human rights. Economic rationality is elevated above basic labour protections, a stance that speaks volumes about whose lives are valued in Singapore's national growth model. If structural exploitation is Singapore's open secret, ideology is its chief enabler, more specifically, meritocracy and Asian values. In the words of Daniel Goh, Asian values became a form of social glue and inoculation. Officials touted traditional values not just to encourage a strong work ethic, but to cultivate personal values which emphasize the importance of national teamwork and to discourage class distinction which tends to polarize group. Now here we see the motive laid bare. This is actually a preemptive strike against class consciousness. If everyone is urged to see the nation as one big team and to view social hierarchy as natural and culturally ordained, then grievances of the lower class are less likely to erupt into open conflict. Now this lower class is not just poorer Singaporeans, but also includes foreign migrant workers. The effect of these narratives is that they tend to legitimize marginalization. If an exploited migrant or disenfranchised local poor person complains, their plight is easily reframed. Hardship is unfortunate but unavoidable in this supposed meritocratic system, or perhaps their values or attitudes didn't match the national ethos of hard work. Singapore today is in many ways a real-world omelette. It's orderly, affluent, and safe. A city that often feels like a utopia compared to many of its regional neighbors. But its smooth functioning is predicated on the labor of a vast underclass of migrant workers and marginalized individuals. The ethical discomfort that this reality ought to provoke is typically submerged between layers of justification, just as in Omelas. The question is, are Singaporeans content to be citizens of Omelas? I had to come back because I'm getting a bit too heated. But I want to summarize. Um, I think it is easy to come up with very comforting justifications. Indeed, migrant workers, um, especially those in Singapore, do have a lot of economic opportunities that they are not afforded to, or that they do not have access to in their home countries, and that's why they even come here in the first place, right? And admittedly, Singapore is not the worst place to be. There are a lot of worse countries, some with very notable human rights abuse, and I can fairly say we are not one of them. But the fact that people has it worse somewhere else doesn't mean that we should be content with our standards right now. Just because exploitation exists elsewhere doesn't mean it's okay where workers are somewhat exploited but not fully exploited, right? Because that's called a spade a spade. And I think that this situation raises a profound dilemma because, especially as Singaporeans, we have been repeatedly told that the economic progress and the stability that we have achieved depends very much on the status quo and how it has been for the last 60 years. That any meaningful change, especially in this concept of migrant workers, would threaten jobs, would disrupt businesses, and cause just significant trickle down effects, particularly trickle down economic effects. But I think this reasoning demands that we face a very uncomfortable question. Should safety and dignity be sacrificed on the altar of economic efficiency? I am not suggesting that we abandon our current system entirely. I'm not saying that at all. Nor am I saying we grant migrant workers every possible right immediately. I mean, what I am advocating is that we at least do what I feel is the bare minimum and the bare minimum safety standards that these workers rightfully deserve. The same standards that we expect of ourselves as citizens. Let us not treat them as a second class. It begins very simply by not treating workers as cargo, right? These are workers with human lives, and these lives matter. Let us grant migrant workers the same basic protections we afford to our everyday citizens. Let us not wait for a tragedy or another event, global event, to suddenly realize what's happening and awaken our conscience. Let us act proactively this time, not reactively. And yes, there will definitely be economic sacrifices. I'm not saying that. But there is more to progress that can be measured by just GDP growth alone. I think let us not walk away from omelets, content to just let whatever is happening in omelets be. But let us not be citizens as well and just sweep everything under the rug. Let us make change. Let us acknowledge that something is not the best, not right at the moment, but that's not the end, and we can do something about it. And say we should do something about it, we must do something about it. Singapore, in particular, especially at this crossroads, has a genuine opportunity to lead by example, to correct course and champion the rights and dignity of those who have built our city from ground up and have done the work that we don't want to do. Let us celebrate them. For the last 60 years, Singapore has demonstrated to the world what is achievable in terms of economic growth and our pace and rapid development of economic success, especially in Asia. Now, in the next 60 years, let us demonstrate that such growth can exist with compassion and moral courage. Thank you.